Hello everyone, welcome back to a new lecture on ISBP 745. In this lecture, we will cover draft. So drafts and calculation of maturity date. Before starting, I would like to give a brief idea about what exactly is a draft. See, draft is a legal document which creates an obligation on the part of the drawee, means the buyer in case of goods, to pay the money to the seller as per the accepted terms of bill of exchange. For example, let us say a seller is selling the goods to the buyer on credit terms, means the buyer is not making the payment immediately. Instead, he may make the payment, let us say, on 90th day from BL date. So once the bill of exchange to this effect is accepted by the buyer, it creates an obligation for the buyer to make the payment on maturity. And in a bill of exchange, drawer means the party who is the maker of bill of exchange, and it is the party entitled to receive the money from the drawee. And drawee is typically the buyer of goods or the party who is obligated to make the payment. And the bill of exchange can be either on side basis or on usance basis, right? But in case of a letter of credit, draft will be drawn either on the issuing bank or the nominated bank or the confirming bank, as the case may be, because in a letter of credit transaction, ultimately bank is obligated to make the payment to the beneficiary on maturity. So in general case, drawee will be the buyer, and if the LC is involved, then drawee will be the bank. So I hope you got a brief overview of draft. Right? Now let us come back to para B. B1 is a draft when required is to be drawn on the bank stated in the credit. We have to note this phrase carefully. When required means draft is not a mandatory document except for a LC available by acceptance. For a LC available by deferred payment, draft is not at all required. For other settlement methods like payment and negotiation, draft is an optional document. So, if LC requires the same, then it should be drawn on the bank as given in the LC. And the usual practice is, if the LC is not confirmed, then the drawee will be the issuing bank or the nominated bank, as the case may be. And if it is a confirmed LC, then the drawee will be the confirming bank. Right? This is the usual practice. And banks will only examine a draft to the extent described in paragraphs B2 till B17. Means banks will check a draft or a bill of exchange only up to the extent as given in these paragraphs. We don't go beyond this, right? First one is tenor. The tenor stated on a draft is to be in accordance with the terms of the credit. The message is very clear. For example, let us say the LC tenor is mentioned as site. Okay. In this case, the draft must not mention a usance period like 30 days from BL or 90 days from BL instead of site. Tenor stated on draft must be in accordance with the LC. Next, when a credit requires a draft to be drawn at a tenor other than site or a certain period after site, it must be possible to establish the maturity date from the data in the draft itself. For example, when a credit calls for drafts at a tenor of 60 days after the bill of lading date, and when the date of the bill of lading is 14 May 2013, the tenor is to be indicated on the draft in one of the following ways. Okay, ISBP suggests 5 ways to indicate a maturity. First, it can indicate like 60 days after bill of lading date, that is 14th May 2013. So we know bill of lading date is 14th May 2013. So the bill of exchange can be drawn like this, and it can indicate the maturity like this at 60 days after bill of lading date, that is 14/5/2013. Okay, this is one way. Next, it can simply mention 60 days after 14 May 2013. Means it need not specifically indicate the bill of lading date. It can mention like 60 days after 14/5. So the maturity date will be counted from 15th, right? Next one is 60 days after bill of lading date and elsewhere on the face of the draft state bill of lading date 14 May 2013 means in this bill of exchange you can see onboard date is mentioned as 14/5/2013 and we know bill of lading date means the onboard date that only we will consider. So in such a scenario, it can mention like 60 days after bill of lading date and we can connect the bill of lading date as 14/5 from here. Like this also it can indicate. Or else it can indicate 60 days date on a draft dated the same day as the date of the bill of lading date. Let's say here instead of 60 days after bill of lading date, it's simply mentioned as 60 days after date or 60 days date and the date is mentioned as 14/5 instead of 7/5 means the maturity is 60 days from the date of bill of exchange. So this is how we have to interpret that. And the last method is they can mention simply the maturity date like 13th July 2013, that is 60 days after the bill of lading date, like this on 13th July for value receipt. So here directly the maturity date is mentioned instead of mentioning the bill of lading date or anything different, right? In any of these ways the bill of exchange should indicate the tenor, right? Next, when the tenor refers to, for example, 60 days after bill of lading date, the onboard date is deemed to be the bill of lading date even when the onboard date is prior to or later than the date of issuance of the bill of lading. This we have already discussed. We will consider the onboard date as the BL date even if bill of lading has been issued later or prior to the onboard date, right? Next one is the words from and after when used to determine maturity dates of drafts signify that the calculation on the maturity date commences the day following the date of the document, shipment or the date of an event stipulated in the credit. For example, 10 days after or from 4 May is 14 May. See, in calculating maturity date of the draft, the terms from and after are having the same interpretation. This was already discussed in UCP Article 3. For both of these terms, we should start the counting from the following day of the event. For example, if tenor is 45 days from the BL and let us assume the onboard date as 12th May, then the 45 days will start from the 13th May, right? Irrespective of whether it's mentioned as 45 days from BL or 45 days after BL, both are same only, right? Now B2 is very important. Okay, there are 3 points B2E 1 2 and 3. All these 3 are very important but often confusing, so please listen carefully to understand the meaning of the same. Before starting, I would like to give some brief idea what exactly is discussed in these 3 paragraphs. Okay, so the mission is to understand which onboard date in a transport document should be considered for calculating the maturity of a draft when there is more than one onboard date is involved. Okay, when there is more than one onboard date is mentioned in a bill of lading or let's say in a air transport document, which one we should consider. Okay, that is the mission. And here the same example is used in all these 3 points, and the example is LC requires a bill of lading and drafts are to be drawn on 60 days from a bill of lading. That is clear. And we know we will consider the onboard date as the BL date even if it is issued prior or after the onboard date. Okay. Now the first scenario is transshipment, right? We have to read this para very carefully. So when a credit requires a bill of lading and draft are to be drawn, for example, at 60 days after or from bill of lading date, both are one and same, no changes, right? And a bill of lading is presented evidencing unloading and reloading of goods. Transshipment means what? Unloading and reloading of goods in the transit of goods, right? So evidencing unloading and reloading of the goods from one vessel to another and showing more than one dated onboard notation and indicating that each shipment was effected from a port within a permitted geographical area or range of ports. The earliest of these dates is to be used for the calculation of the maturity date. For example, credit requires shipment from any European port. Okay, and the bill of lading evidences onboard vessel A from Dublin on 14 May with transshipment effected on board vessel B from Rotterdam on 16 May. The draft should reflect 60 days after the earliest onboard date in a European port, that is 14 May. Don't confuse this with partial shipment, because in a partial shipment the transport document will also come partially, means more than one bill of lading in the case of a bill of lading will be presented. But here note this carefully, the goods are transshipped at Rotterdam. The goods are shipped from Dublin on this onboard date, means 14th of May, and was transshipped at Rotterdam. Here you can clearly see it is transshipped at Rotterdam. Vessel and voyage number is T002 and onboard on 16/5 year. Okay, so in this scenario we have to consider earliest of these onboard dates. So what is the earliest onboard date in this case? It is 14/5. So the 60 days after 14/5 will start from 15th of May, right? So when goods are transshipped, we have to consider the earliest shipped onboard date, right? Next one is when the bill of lading evidencing shipment of goods on the same vessel. Note this very carefully, same vessel. So this is also not a partial shipment. The goods are shipped on the same vessel from more than one port within a permitted geographical area or range of ports and shows more than one dated onboard notation. The latest of these dates is to be used for the calculation of the maturity date. For example, see, a credit requires shipment of goods from any European port, and the bill of lading evidences part of the goods are loaded on board vessel A from Dublin on 14 May and remainder on board the same vessel from Rotterdam on 16th May. The draft should reflect 60 days after the latest onboard date, that is 16th May. See here, the voyage number, vessel name, everything is same, but part of the goods are shipped from Dublin and part are shipped from Rotterdam. So we have to consider the latest onboard date. So in this case, it's exactly opposite of transshipment. We have to consider the latest date, that is 16th of May. So our 60-day count will start from 17th of May, right? Now the third scenario is when a credit requires a bill of lading. Okay, credit requires only one bill of lading and drafts are to be drawn, for example, at 60 days after or from the bill of lading date, and more than one set of bills of lading is presented under one draft. So LC requires only one bill of lading, but in the same presentation for a single draft, okay, for a single bill of exchange, more than one set of bills of lading are presented. In such a case, the onboard date of the latest bill of lading will be used for the calculation of maturity date. Onboard date of the latest bill of lading. How to find which is the latest bill of lading? Based on the issue date. Let us consider there are three sets of bill of lading are presented under one draft, and all the three indicates the issue date, onboard date as same. So obviously we will consider 7/5 as the date of shipment, because of course this is the latest bill of lading. What if the first set states 4/5, both issue date as well as onboard date are same, and second set states issue date is 6/5 but it indicates the onboard date as 5/5, and the third set is issued on 7/5 but it states the onboard date is 3/5. Tell me which onboard date we will consider as the date of shipment. We have to consider 3/5 as the date of shipment because this is the latest bill of lading. So in a nutshell, if goods are subjected to transshipment in a BL and more than one onboard date is present in a BL, earliest onboard date has to be considered for calculating maturity of draft. And if parts of goods are shipped from more than one port in the same vessel within the permitted geographical area or range of ports, then we should consider the latest onboard date. And if more than one set of BL are presented under same draft and evidence different onboard dates, then we should consider the onboard date of the latest bill of lading for calculating the maturity of draft. Note this very carefully and remember this applies only for calculation of maturity. Okay, because for calculation of period of presentation the logic is entirely different that we will discuss at the time of discussing transport documents. So for the calculation of maturity, this is the logic. If transshipment, we have to consider the earliest, and if it is not a transshipment, then we have to consider the latest. And if more than one BL is presented with different onboard dates, we should consider the onboard date of the latest BL. Okay, take a note of that. This is very important. Often questions will be asked from this particular area. All right. Now let us move to B3. While the examples in paragraphs B2, E1, 2, 3 refers to bill of lading dates, the same principles apply to any basis for determining a maturity date. Means what? The logic remains the same for any transport document. It can be a BL, it can be a air transport document, or it can be a truck receipt, whatever. While considering a date for calculation of maturity of draft, the logic remains the same. Okay, so this also we have to note very carefully. Next one is maturity date. When a draft states a maturity date by using an actual date, that date is to reflect the terms of the credit. We have already discussed in B2, there are certain ways to indicate the maturity of a bill of exchange. In that methods, one method is the bill of exchange can exactly mention the maturity date. If that date is mentioned, such date is to reflect the terms of the credit. For example, let us consider the tenor of LC is 60 days from BL date. And as we discussed in that actual example, the bill of exchange date is 14th of May. Right? Now, the 60 days should reflect 13/7/2024 only. It should not mention any other dates. If it is mentioning a wrong date instead of 13/7, which is inconsistent with the tenor of LC, then that is also a discrepancy, right? Next one is for drafts drawn. For example, at 60 days site, the maturity date is established as follows. Now, this is little different. The previous tenors were like 60 days from BL date or 60 days from invoice date, whatever the case. But here it is mentioned as 60 days site. Right, in such cases, how to interpret the maturity date? That is what discussed further. So consider LC tenor is mentioned as 60 days at site. Okay. So in case of a complying presentation, the maturity date will be 60 days after the day of presentation to the bank on which the draft is drawn. That is the issuing bank or the confirming bank or a nominated bank that agrees to act on its nomination. So consider LC tenor is 60 days at site, and documents were presented to the issuing bank on 2nd May, right? And the documents were found complying on 4th of May. Now, the 60 days will be calculated from 3rd of May because the documents were presented on 2nd of May. So, the maturity will be counted from the day following the day of presentation of documents, right? Actually, this is well similar to other tenors like 60 days from BL or whatever. But in those tenors, we will use the BL date or the onboard date as the reference date to arrive at the maturity. Here we will use the presentation date to arrive at the maturity in case of a complying presentation. Now the next thing is, what if the document is not complying? In that case, when such drawee bank has not provided a notice of refusal, the maturity date will be 60 days after the day of presentation to it. Means, as the bank has not acted as per UCP 600 Article 16, means as it did not send the notice of refusal within the cutoff time, it cannot claim the documents as discrepant. It must make the payment as it is a complying presentation. Right? In such a case, the maturity will start from the day next to the day of presentation of documents to that bank. These two paragraphs discuss what if the issuing bank provided a notice of refusal on time. So the first case is the drawee bank is the issuing bank. When the drawee bank is the issuing bank and it has provided a notice of refusal at the latest 60 days after the date the issuing bank accepts the waiver of the applicant. Means generally if the documents are discrepant and the issuing bank send a notice of refusal, Actually, issuing bank is not having any payment obligation. In such a cases, issuing bank will settle the funds only if the discrepancies are waived by the applicant and such waiver is acceptable to the issuing bank. Note carefully. It's not like applicant has accepted the discrepancies or waived the discrepancies, so the issuing bank will make the payment. The discrepancy waiver should also be acceptable to the issuing bank, right? In such a case, the maturity date of the bill will be calculated by considering the date the issuing bank accepts the applicant's waiver of discrepancies. For example, let us say the same case we can take. LC tenor is 60 days at site and the documents were presented to the issuing bank on 2nd May, right? And the documents were found discrepant on 4th May. And the applicant submitted the waiver of discrepancies on 5th May and issuing bank accepted the waiver request on 6th May only. So the 60 days will be calculated from 7th May only. Means the day next to the day the issuing bank accepted the waiver of discrepancies from the applicant, right? Next one is, what if the drawee bank is a bank other than the issuing bank? Means the draft drawn on a bank other than the issuing bank. Usually, if the LC is confirmed, then the draft will be drawn on the confirming bank. And if the LC is available by acceptance with the nominated bank, then the draft will be drawn on the nominated bank. But if the documents are discrepant, and even if issuing bank is accepted the discrepancy waiver from the applicant, confirming bank or the nominated bank is not having any obligation to accept such a waiver. In such cases, how to calculate the maturity? That is discussed here. When the drawee bank is a bank other than the issuing bank and it has provided a notice of refusal at the latest, means it has provided the notice of refusal, let it be the confirming bank or the nominated bank, it has provided notice of refusal within 5 banking days. In such a case, latest 60 days after the date of the acceptance advice of the issuing bank. Whenever a document is discrepant, the confirming bank or the nominated bank will ultimately send the documents to the issuing bank, right? So let us take an example to understand this. Let us consider the same example. LC tenor is 60 days at site and the documents were presented to the confirming bank on 2nd of May, but the documents were found discrepant by the confirming bank. So the confirming bank issued a notice of refusal and forwarded the documents to the issuing bank, and the documents were received by the issuing bank on 7th of May. And once the documents are received, obviously the issuing bank is having one option. It can go for waiver of discrepancies from the applicant, and the applicant submitted the waiver of discrepancies on 8th of May and it was acceptable to the issuing bank, and issuing bank accepted and sent a notice of acceptance to the confirming bank on 9th May. In this scenario, the 60 days will be calculated from 10th May, that is the day following the day of acceptance by the issuing bank. So here the reference date is the date of receipt of acceptance advice of issuing bank. But when such drawee bank does not agree to act on the acceptance advice of the issuing bank, the undertaking to honor on the due date is that of the issuing bank. Means, although issuing bank has accepted the documents, the confirming bank or the nominated bank is not having any obligation, as we discussed previously, to make the payment. In such a case, who is responsible? Obviously, ultimately, the issuing bank has to make the payment on maturity date by considering the day from which it has accepted the waiver request from the applicant as per this para, right? So hope this is clear, and remember you will get questions from this area, so pay more attention to this para, right? The next one is, the drawee bank is to advise or confirm the maturity date to the presenter. Means the issuing bank or confirming bank or nominated bank, as the case may be, have to confirm the maturity date to the presenter. This applies to both complying document as well as for a discrepant document if the discrepancy waiver is acceptable to that bank. Next one is, the method of calculation of tenor and maturity dates as shown above also applies to a credit available by deferred payment or in some cases negotiation, that is when there is no requirement for a draft to be presented by the beneficiary. We have already discussed draft is not a mandatory document for all methods of settlement except LC available by acceptance, which doesn't mean the logic which we have discussed just now is not applicable to the other methods of settlement. Even in deferred payment, draft won't be there. Also in negotiation, draft is not mandatory. Still, the logic can be applied to calculate the tenor and maturity dates as we discussed just now. Next one is banking days, grace days, delays in remittance. Payment is to be made in immediately available funds. What is meant by immediately available funds? Means, let's say the draft is in currency euro, then the funds must be settled in euro currency by the bank which is making the payment. They cannot settle the funds in USD since they are having the funds in USD, right? On the due date at the place where the draft or documents are payable, provided that such due date is a banking day in that place. Means the payment has to be made on the due date provided that day is a banking day for the bank which is making the payment. If the due date is not a banking day for the issuing bank, then the date will fall on the next following working day. This applies to all the banks, right? That is what discussed further. When the due date is a non-banking day, the payment is due on the first banking day following the due date, right? So when the due date is a holiday or a non-banking day at the place of the bank which is going to make the payment, then the due date will fall on the next following banking day. And delays in the remittance of funds, for example grace days, the time it takes to remit the funds, etc., are not to be in addition to the stated or agreed due date as defined by the draft or documents. Simply the funds must be settled on the due date without fail. There is no grace period or time for transit of funds, especially in case of eastern currencies like Japanese yen or Chinese yuan. The settlement process is often time taking, right? And it is the responsibility of the funding bank to make the payment on due date without fail, or else the beneficiary bank may demand interest for the delayed period. So by this, let us end this part. We will cover the rest of the paras in our next part. And many of the paragraphs which we have discussed in this part are really important when it comes to exam point of view. So pay more attention to this part. Okay. Thank you all, and we'll meet you in the next lecture.